Hi everyone, welcome to a brand new episode of Front Row. Here we have an eminent personality here with us, an Indian economist, Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. He was the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission of India. So Mr. Ahluwalia, I have two questions for you. The first question is, during your tenure as the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission of India, what were the key strategies and policies that contributed to India's economic growth, and what were the challenges to implement them?
Well, that's a big question for 10 years of being at the Planning Commission. Look, a strategy has many components, and in the Planning Commission, you're kind of involved in all of them. But I would say that probably the one new and different thing that we tried was to push infrastructure development through a public-private partnership mode. And it was quite clear to us that the resources available with the public sector were limited. The demand for investment in infrastructure was huge. India was pretty behind the curve on infrastructure development compared to, let's say, other countries in East Asia. So we needed a big push, and it had to involve the private sector. Now, infrastructure investment is not like normal investments where you just go and take a market risk. There's a lot that government has to do, a lot of permissions, regulatory structures, etc., etc. So we found a way of parceling out projects through a public-private partnership mode where basically the government would offer the detailed terms and conditions on which the project could be allotted to someone, and they were then asked to bid for, let's say, the lowest capital subsidy that they would be willing to accept. And we had in our mind what's the kind of capital subsidy that we're willing to tolerate. But the actual subsidy was determined competitively. So that way, a private sector partner got the project, but got it as a result of bidding. Sometimes the bidding was in terms of capital subsidy, sometimes the bidding was in terms of revenue share. So whoever offered a higher revenue share, assuming that they did what was necessary technically, would be allotted the project. And it was a pretty complicated setup because, the public sector has its own ways of working. And I think one of the things the private sector always argued was that once the terms and conditions were fixed, the government no longer viewed it as a partnership, in the sense that you couldn't go back to the government and say, hey, listen, when we agreed on this, this was our assumption, but the world has changed. It's very difficult for a civil servant to then alter the terms in favor of the private partner. So we made a lot of sort of attempts to clarify the constraints on the government. And we said that, look, this is a competitive process. Once you bid for the project, you need to abide by whatever the bid conditions were. I think we had problems, but on the whole, we did succeed. And there was a lot of public-private partnership projects that took off. Ports, not so much ports, but the development of terminals in ports, new terminals in ports. Of course, a lot of highway projects, certain kind of railway projects, airports, and of course in electricity generation, we actually invited the private sector to come in, and there's quite a lot of private sector expansion in the electricity generation sector. So I think that was new and helpful, but we learned a lot. It turned out to be vastly more complicated than we had originally thought.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ahluwalia. So moving on, in your extensive experience in working with international organizations, how do you think Sri Lanka can strengthen its economic ties and collaborations with regional and global partners?
Well, I mean, the most important regional ties these days are trade and investment. And I think Sri Lanka is following an open policy as far as I can see. It's located right next to India. which, if India does well, and I do hope we will do well, you have a big expanding market right next to you. So it makes a lot of sense for Sri Lanka to see how they can exploit the Indian market. That's a question of getting trade access. We already have a free trade agreement. You could probably improve the terms for Sri Lanka under that free trade agreement. I think on investment, there are really no restrictions. I don't anticipate that Sri Lanka itself would want to be an outward investor into India, though it would be very welcome if it were to do so. But certainly they could invite Indian investment into Sri Lanka. And when I say trade, obviously people think of trades in goods, but I think the trade in services, particularly tourism, is a huge potential. Because what you're seeing in India is the emergence of a new, much more prosperous than before middle class. And you offer them the opportunity of a foreign holiday with the cheapest air transport from their home city to destination. And as far as I can see, excellent hotels, wonderful climate, beach. Already, I'm amazed at the number of Indians I know who are currently in this hotel. So clearly there's evidence that you're attracting tourists, but I think that what you're doing at the moment is a fraction of what is possible. I say that primarily because I think the next 10 years you'll see a huge expansion in Indians wanting to travel, because their income levels will get to the point where they suddenly want to travel. And many of them have been to Europe, sort of been there, done that. And I can imagine that when an Indian first starts to travel, he thinks of a European destination. But once you've been there once or twice, etc., then I think you just want to get away to somewhere nice where you can spend a pleasant 4 days with your family or friends. And to my mind, you're beautifully located from that point of view.
Thank you, Mr. Ahluwalia, for that insightful discussion. And to our viewers, do stay tuned in for more insightful episodes in future. Thank you.